All right, so we are ready to go. So as I mentioned, this is the open review session where we're going to make sure that everybody is ready to go for exam number 2. But before we get to that, I just wanted to let everybody know about the social media professional development assignment number 3. This is the one that's out this week. And actually, before we get to that, just one other thing about the innovations and suggestions survey. So I am ecstatic about the response for the innovations and suggestions. I think it's going really well. It's been a big success so far, so thank you to everybody that's involved. But one of the things now that I need to decide on is what exactly is this going to be worth in this course in terms of bonus points. So I've been trying to figure out something that would be motivating, what you would find rewarding in terms of getting involved in the social media development, what you think would be motivating to get involved in the innovations and suggestions. But at the same time, I also have to come up with something that is fair, so it's not such a large bonus as to make the other assignments in this course not count. It's not such a large bonus as to be unfair to anybody that doesn't take part in these 2 optional activities. So I've been kind of mulling around with that, but I thought in the spirit of the innovations and suggestions, why don't I just ask everybody here. So for this week, in the survey for innovations and suggestions, there's 2 additional questions. One is, what do you think would be a motivating and fair reward for the innovations and suggestions top tweet of the week? And then the other question is, what do you think would be a motivating and fair reward for the social media professional development? So it could be a certain percentage towards your final grade. It could be a certain percentage towards each exam. It could be dropping the grade for certain assignments. But again, try to think of what you would feel as a student, because you'll have more of an immediate knowledge of that experience. Try to think of what you would feel would be motivating, something where you would say to yourself, yes, I'm glad I'm in on this. I'm glad that I'm doing this. This is the bonus points are worth my time. But at the same time, being a fair amount. So the extreme unfair would be, you do the social media professional development, you get 100% of the course. That's massively unfair to anybody that doesn't want to get involved, and it also undermines the entire learning portion of this course. So it needs to be worth something. So if you can kind of, give suggestions in terms of what you think would be motivating and fair for those 2, I would really appreciate it, because I am going to try to make a decision on that once I get that feedback, and any guidance that you can give me will help me come up with something that, again, will fit for these assignments. All right, so that was the first thing. Second thing, social media professional development assignment number 3. So we are working up to developing your network, developing your connection to the community. And one of the reasons we're doing this is so eventually you can do what we call the big ask. And the big ask is where you reach out to your community and say, give me some help. So for example, here we have Randy McCarthy, and he tweeted out to the community that I'm part of this following tweet, and he said, academic friends, what is the best writing advice for undergraduate who will be writing their first APA-style manuscript this semester? I would like to give them tips and tricks from the pros, i.e. you, please and thank you. So he did this, he asked his community for help. And basically, it's clear that he will be teaching an introductory writing course this semester. And what in essence he's doing is saying, look, I could either do hours and hours of work on my own, going through textbooks, going through studies, going through, searching the internet, looking for best practices and all these tips and tricks. Or I can ask you to do some of the work and lean on your experience and basically say, instead of me doing all that work, why don't you do some of that work for me? So that's a big ask, right? It's a big ask to go out and say, hey, I'm supposed to be doing this thing on my own, but can you do some of it for me, right? That's what we call the big ask. So we want to make sure that we have built those connections before we do anything like this. We want to make sure that we've built those connections before we ask people to contribute to our success. Because again, this is something that your network and your community will do all the time, but they've earned it. And the way that you earn it is you basically give before you take. So the next series of assignments are all going to be part of this giving to your community before you start pulling from your community. So if you take a look at Randy McCarthy's Twitter homepage, you'll see that he has over 2,000 tweets. He has been contributing to his community for a while now. So when that ask came out, it was really easy for his people in his network to say, oh, he's contributed so much. Sure, I'll take some time out and I'll tweet this, or sure, I'll retweet this and spread the word, get it out to a bigger number of people, because he's given so much up at this point that it's easy for him to make that ask. So that's what we're building towards, and we're going to do that by basically starting out simple with a little bit of amplification. So amplification is where you basically amplify somebody else's idea. You basically say, oh, hey, this person had a great idea. Let me tell other people about it. And that's the way that we're going to be contributing at this point. Because at your sort of professional stage as psychologists, you might not have a lot of original content. You might not have published a article. You might not have experience teaching, that you can say, oh, hey, here's this great idea that I've come up with. But you can definitely amplify the voices of others, and that's the way that we're going to start. So what we're going to do is, and as you can see here, that's exactly what I did. So I didn't have any tips at this point, but I basically said, there's some great advice in this thread. I retweeted it, and that not only amplified his voice, but also any of my students that follow me could then take a look at that thread and say, oh, maybe when I'm writing my paper, I'll do some of this myself. So that's what we're going to be doing this week. We're going to retweet 2 tweets. We're going to start off slow. From any of the psychologists that you now follow. So if you remember last assignment, follow 5 psychologists. Those psychologists will be tweeting out over the coming week. And you can go a little bit deeper into their history if you need to. But you're going to retweet any 2 tweets from the psychologists that you follow. That's the assignment for this week. No comments are required, save one hashtag that we'll get to in just a bit. So no comments are required. You don't have to add anything to it. But if you do want to comment, then make sure that you read the PDF that I've uploaded to the social media development folder, the do's and don'ts of networking online. And they have a very short, little list of, do say these types of things, don't say these types of things. And that'll just make sure that years from now you don't have to go back through your tweets and delete anything when you're getting yourself a new job. But you don't need to comment anything, but if you do want to say something, just take a look at that checklist. Make sure you're not crossing any lines or doing anything unprofessional. So we're going to retweet any 2 tweets from the psychologists that you follow. We're going to amplify their voices as your contribution to their community. And to help me track this, the only thing that you need to write is the hashtag FuturePsych2019. And that's the way, when it's due, Monday, October 14th, then I can wake up on Tuesday morning and basically search for that hashtag and see the involvement and the things that you have retweeted. So make sure that you use that hashtag and get those 2 retweets out and amplify the voices of your community by midnight on Monday, October 14th. Any questions about that social media development assignment? All right, perfect. Okay, so we are going to have some time actually most of the time for an open review session. So if you have any questions that you want to ask, we will be getting to those in a little bit. But one thing that I have identified from previous exams that I really do want to make sure that we address is the idea of identifying the contingencies. So if you recall last class, we had 4 contingencies in operant learning. We had positive reinforcement, we had negative reinforcement, we had positive punishment, and we had negative punishment. And one of the things that we need to know how to do is how to look at a situation and identify that what contingency is at play. And this is something that I find students often get confused. So I was hoping that we'll spend the first little portion here taking a look at a strategy, steps that you can use in order to identify what contingency is in play. All right, so we'll start off with an example and then we'll have some some examples that you will do as practice. So let's take a look at this one here. So we're going to try to identify the contingency that is in place. So it says when, and this is one of the leftover questions from the exam pool that I use to make your exams. And I hope you appreciate the fact that I really try my hardest not to do the double negative, triple negative thing that's going on here, but I will use it for this example here. So when Sean doesn't cry, he doesn't get an extra helping of dessert. As a result, he always cries at the dinner table. So basically, when Sean cries, he gets an extra helping of dessert. As a result, he always cries at the dinner table. The question now is, what contingency is at play here? What is the contingency that is in effect in this particular description? And it might seem pretty straightforward, it might not seem pretty straightforward, but there are steps that you can go through to identify what it is that is going on here. And the first step, step number one, and this one is crucial because it contributes to all the other steps. Step number one is you have to identify the behavior. And the tricky part here is that there's often multiple behaviors that are described in the description, and you're looking specifically for the behavior that changed. So they will mention one behavior that changed in each particular description. You have to zero in on the behavior that changed. So for example here, it goes, when Sean doesn't cry, he doesn't get an extra helping of dessert. As a result, he always cries at the dinner table. So what this means is that when Sean cries, his parents give him dessert. When he doesn't cry, his parents do not give him dessert. So this one is a little bit more straightforward, which is why I chose it at the beginning. But notice that there are two behaviors that are going on here. There's the crying that Sean is doing, and there's the giving of the dessert, right? So you give the dessert, Sean doesn't cry. You don't give the dessert, Sean cries. Or Sean cries, he gets the dessert. Sean doesn't cry, he doesn't get the dessert. So both of those behaviors, because this is more of a real world situation, have contingencies that they're under. They have contingencies that they're operating under. So in a question like this, you need to know which one of those behaviors are we asking the contingency for. Are we asking for the dessert giving behavior? Or are we asking for the crying behavior? And the answer to that is only one of those will be mentioned that they change. Only one of those will be mentioned that there's either an increase or a decrease. And that's what you're looking for. So that's step one. So in this one here, we have crying as a behavior. Because it mentions that when Sean doesn't cry, he doesn't get an extra helping of dessert. So as a result, now he's changed. He always cries. So Sean has gone from not crying to always crying. And that's the only description of behavior that is changed in this question here. So step number one, you have to identify what is the behavior that has changed. So look for a behavior that has either become more frequent, look for a behavior that has either become less frequent, but definitely there's only going to be one behavior that's mentioned that has changed in its frequency, and that's your first challenge. You have to identify what that is. So the behavior that has changed is the crying. He's gone from doesn't cry to always cries. That's the behavior that has changed. So that's step one. Step two, once you've identified that behavior that's changed, you need to ask yourself, did the behavior increase or did the behavior decrease? So we go back and we see that it went from Sean not crying to Sean always crying. So that is an increase in the amount of crying. That's a change of an increase in frequency of crying. So for step two, did the behavior increase or decrease? In this case, it increased. Once it increases, you've already answered half of your question. Once it's increased, you know it's reinforcement. So this question here is reinforcement. It's a reinforcement schedule. And that's because Sean increased his crying. He went from not crying to now always crying. So we've got half of it done. We've identified this as reinforcement. The last thing we need to do now is we need to figure out, is it positive reinforcement or is it negative reinforcement? So we have to ask ourselves, did the behavior that has changed, did this crying behavior that has increased, change as a result of something being added or was something taken away? So was something given to Sean and as a result his behavior, his crying increased, or was something taken away from Sean as a result his crying increased? And in this case, when he doesn't cry, and again, the double negative here, when he doesn't cry, he doesn't get an extra helping of dessert, which means that when he does cry, he gets an extra helping of dessert. So crying leads to an extra helping of dessert. Crying leads to the addition of something. Crying leads to the addition of dessert. Addition equals positive. So to finally answer the question, we combine it with step 2, where an increase is reinforcement. And we see that the situation described here, when Sean doesn't cry, he doesn't get an extra helping of dessert. As a result, he always cries at the dinner table. Sean is under a contingency of positive reinforcement. All right, so again, step 1, identify the change, the behavior that changed. Step 2, identify if the change increased, the behavior increased, or the behavior decreased as a result of the change. Behavior increased or decreased. And then step 3, did the behavior change because something was added after the behavior occurred, or did the behavior change because something was taken away after the behavior occurred? And then you put those together and you end up with, in this case, positive reinforcement. All right, so let's give this one a try. So that one right there okay, so that one right there, sorry. I'll read it out. Kyle's mother tells him, if you clean your room, you won't have to go to grandma's this weekend. So Kyle cleans his room. So ask yourself, go through the 3 steps, try to figure this one out, and then we'll take it up in just a moment. So how many people have an answer? Okay, I'll give you just a little bit more time to work on this one. All right, so step 1, what is the behavior that changed? Kyle cleaning his room. So we have Kyle mothers telling them that if you clean your room, you don't have to go to grandma's house. So if you clean your room, and then Kyle cleans his room. So that's the only change in behavior that we know. That's the only thing, that outcome that we know, that Kyle cleans his room. So that's the behavior that we're looking at. Now, step 2, did that behavior increase or did it decrease? The behavior increased. So the cleaning of the room increased, right? Kyle cleaned his room as an increase in cleaning. So this is reinforcement. So we got halfway there. We got to reinforcement. Now, was the consequence of cleaning his room something given, something added to Kyle, or was something taken away? Something was taken away. So he was originally going to grandma's house for the weekend, and then when he cleaned his room, the result was that that was taken away, no longer needed to go to grandma's. So in this case, this is negative, and it's reinforcement. So this would be a case of negative reinforcement. This is a nice one to illustrate. When you're looking at these contingencies, always make sure that you're only interpreting the information that is given to you. Because a lot of students second guess themselves on the negative and positive because they reinterpret the situation where a negative becomes a positive, and you can always do that. So always stick to what is written there. So for example, it would be a mistake in this case to take a look at this and say, well, Kyle doesn't have to go to his grandma's this weekend, so didn't he gain freedom? This weekend, didn't he gain, the time that he has? So wouldn't that be positive? Because as a result of cleaning his room, he got to do what he wanted. Yes, you can look at not going to grandma's as gaining your freedom for the weekend. It's not going to help you answer this question correctly because, again, limit yourself to what is in the question here. So you won't have to go to grandma's this weekend has a number of real-world implications, but when you're answering questions like this, stick with what is written and don't start to second guess or add extra information there, because I have seen students do that where they're like, well, you don't go to the weekend, but now you can go out with your friends. So isn't that positive reinforcement? In this case, the way that it's described, this is a negative reinforcement contingency. All right, let's try another one. If I think about upcoming exams, I get anxious. Therefore, I don't think about my exams. All right, so analyze that one. Step 1 was the behavior that changed. Step 2, did the change go up or down? Step 3, was something added or was something taken away? All right, so let's talk about this one. So if I think about my an upcoming exam, I get anxious. Therefore, I don't think about my exam. So what is the behavior that has changed? Thinking about exams. So the behavior that has a consequence, there's another way to think about it, is thinking about the exams. Step 2, has thinking about the exams increased or has thinking about the exams decreased? It's decreased. So decreased means punishment. So we know that it's our first punishment contingency. And then lastly, when they thought about exams, was something added to their situation or was something taken away from the situation? It was, no, you got it. I just think it was maybe just louder.
What?
So what is it, added or taken away?
Added.
Okay, I hear whispers of added. You're right. No, it's correct. It's added. Anxiousness is added, right? They feel anxious. So you think about the exam and you go from feeling the way that you feel to being anxiousness having been added to the situation. So it's added to the situation. That's positive. So we have behavior decreasing. Thinking about the exams is decreased. That's punishment. Because of an addition of anxiousness, that's positive. So this is an example of positive punishment. And again, this is a nice example, and I think some of you might have experienced that when I said, oh, is it positive or is it negative? And you started second guessing yourself. Don't do that. Rely only on what is up here. Because if you're like, well, it's an increase in anxiousness, isn't that a decrease in calmness? So couldn't it be negative? It could be. It could be if you start reinterpreting what is given in the question. So be very careful about doing that. Just stick to what's in the question. If there's an increase in anxiousness, it has to come with a decrease in calmness. That's how anxiousness works. But the phrasing in the question, work off of that, just what's in the question, anxiousness was added, that's positive. Thinking went down, that's punishment. This is an example of positive punishment. All right, well, we have to do at least one kind of textbook example, so let's look at this one here. So the pigeon pecks a response key and receives food. As a result, the probability of key pecking increases. So give that one a look. Let's see what that contingency is. All right, so what is the behavior that has changed? Key pecking. So key pecking increases, that's the change in behavior. Kind of answered question number 2. Did it go up or did it go down? It went up. So we're dealing with a reinforcement situation here. So we identified key pecking as the behavior that changed. We identified that it increased, that is reinforcement. And now all we have to ask is, what was the consequence of pecking that key? Was something added or was something taken away? So what does the question indicate? What was added? Food was added. So food was added, that's positive. So this is an example of positive reinforcement. The food was added, that's positive. Pecking went up, that's reinforcement. All right, let's keep going. Melissa stayed out past her curfew and subsequently lost car privileges for a week. As a result, she never again stayed out past her curfew. So how many have made a decision? Okay, I'll give you a little bit more time. All right, so let's analyze this one. So Melissa stayed out past curfew and subsequently lost car privileges for a week. As a result, she never again stayed out past her curfew. So what is the behavior that has changed?
Staying out past curfew.
Staying out past curfew. Has it gone up or has it gone down?
Gone down.
It's gone down. So this is a punishment contingency. And now the last thing we need to know is the consequence of breaking curfew. Was something added to her situation or was something taken away? Taken away. So her car privileges were taken away. So that makes it negative, and this would be an example of negative punishment. So she does the behavior, the consequence is something is taken away, that's negative, her car privileges were taken away, because of that the behavior goes down, that's punishment. So this is a case of negative punishment. All right, next one. Paula yells at her child when he breaks a dish. As a result, he breaks dishes even more frequently. So what is this contingency? right, so what is the behavior that changed? Breaking dishes. So we have breaking dishes being the only behavior that is indicated to have changed. I'll talk about that in just a second. Has breaking dishes gone up or gone down? Gone up. So breaking dishes has gone up. That means that this is actually reinforcement. So this is a great example of why you need to analyze all these kind of components, because a parent yelling at their child is typically meant to be punishing, right? It's meant as punishment. However, the dishes are being broken more frequently. So that indicates that it's actually reinforcement. So this is something to keep in mind when you're going through these situations. The intentions of the person might backfire, as in this case. And as psychologists, we can only analyze the outcome of the behavior. And if the outcome of the behavior is that the behavior increased, that is reinforcement, regardless of what it might look like, regardless of what other people might say, oh, she's punishing that child. If that child is breaking dishes more frequently as a result, it is reinforcement. So it's reinforcement with something added to the child's life as a result of the dishes breaking, or was something taken away? Something was added. Specifically, Paula's yells were added. So in this case, this is positive reinforcement. It doesn't seem like an extremely healthy contingency, but it is positive reinforcement because something was added, the yells were added as a result of the dishes being broke. That led to dishes being broke more frequently, positive reinforcement. And this is also a good example of where two behaviors are very explicitly mentioned. So the dishes breaking is mentioned, but also Paula's yelling is mentioned as well. And the key here to remember is that we have no information about what happens to Paula's yelling. And I would imagine that if Paula takes a look at the situation, at some point she's going to say, you know what, the yelling's not working, right? My child's breaking more dishes than he did before, so the yelling's not working, so I'm not going to yell anymore. In that case, notice that her yelling has now decreased. So that means that she's on punishment. Her yelling has decreased as a result of the addition of dish breaking. So that would be an example of positive punishment. However, nothing is mentioned about her yelling. So when you're analyzing these, that's step one, identifying the behavior that has changed. Don't imagine the changed behavior. Don't project or try to infer other changes in behavior. Limit yourself to what is mentioned in the question. So nothing is mentioned about what happens to Paula's yelling. But the only thing that's mentioned is the breaking dishes has gone up. So make sure that you do identify that first aspect and don't get caught up on any of the other behaviors that might be going in there. Because one thing that we'll see as we go into operant learning more is that anybody that places a contingency upon someone else is also under their own contingency, right? So contingencies can be seen as this kind of feedback loop, and we'll see how this is especially true when you get into like abusive relationships. But for these questions here, only one behavior will be indicated to have changed. Limit yourself to looking at that one particular behavior. All right, when Amir teased his sister, she hugged him. He never again teased her. All right, so what's going on here? All right, so please come to a decision, identify the contingency. That is correct. So, behavior that changed. Step one, what's the behavior that changed? The teasing. So the teasing is the only behavior that is mentioned in terms of whether it changed or not. Has it gone up or down? It's gone down. So he never again teased her, so the teasing went down. And was it the result of something being added as a result of teasing or something taken away? Added. So the hug was what was being added. So behavior goes down, that's punishment. As a result of a hug being added, that's positive. This is positive punishment. And again, this is a great example of why you need to take a look at each component and not get drawn into what society kind of considers punishment or reinforcement. Because most of us would think, oh, that's so nice, she hugged him, right? And nice things can't be a punishment, right? That's not how punishment works. Well, in reality, that is how punishment works. Punishment works when the behavior goes down. So even if she hugged him and the teasing went down, that's positive punishment. If he teased her and she gave him a piece of pie and the teasing went down, that's positive punishment. If he teased her and she bought him the latest video game console and the teasing went down, that's positive punishment. So it's the outcome that determines whether it's punishment or reinforcement. It's not the sort of nature of the consequence and how it's viewed in society. And again, make sure that you can tease that out, because sometimes with ones like this, it's like, oh, when Amir teases his sister, she hugged him. Oh, that's got to be reinforcement, right? She's hugging him. That's a nice, it's not what reinforcement is. He never teased her again, it's punishment. All right, a couple of more. When I banged on the heating pipe, it stopped making a noise. The next time I heard that noise, I immediately banged on the pipe. All right, so let's analyze this one. What's the behavior that has changed? Banging on the pipe. So before, banging on the pipe infrequently. Now, immediately after the noise, the pipe is banged on. So we have banging on the pipe as the behavior. Has the probability or frequency of banging on the pipe gone up or down?
Up.
It's gone up, so we have reinforcement. And as a result of banging on the pipe, was something added to the environment or was something taken away? Something was taken away. So the noise from the heating pipe was taken away. So this is an important one, again, to just kind of highlight that the taken away or addition of things to the environment happens after the consequence. So the noisy pipe had to have started making a noise at some point. So at some point, the noise had to have been added to the environment. But the question is, what happened as a consequence of the behavior? Hitting the pipe led to the noise being taken away. That takeaway is what makes it negative. So again, don't start second guessing yourself about, well, the noise had to have been added if it was going to be there in the first place, so isn't that positive? It's after the behavior occurs, what happens to the environment, what happens to the person's situation. Noise is taken away, that's negative. Pipe banging goes up, that's reinforcement. All right, I mentioned the cycle, the feed-forward loop on violence. So there's this question right here. When Pedro punched his sister, she punched him back. He never again punched her. right, so let's take a look at this one. What is the behavior that has changed? Punching. Specifically, we got 2 instances of punching. Whose punching has changed? Pedro's. So Pedro's punching has changed. That's the behavior that is that's the target of this contingency. Has the punching increased or decreased? The punching has decreased, and so that it's punishment. And did it decrease as the result of an addition of something, or did it decrease as a result of something being taken away? Addition. So it was decreased as a result of the addition of the punch from his sister. So this is an example of positive punishment. So addition is positive, behavior goes down, punishment. Interestingly, this is one where, again, some people might get confused on this if you don't take it step by step, because of this she punched him back incidents here. So when Pedro is under a contingency, in this case a positive punishment contingency, his sister, interestingly, is also under a contingency. So in her world, from her point of view, punching was part of her environment, right? Pedro started punching her. As a result of that, she had a behavior, she punched him back. And because she punched him back, the punching stopped. So while Pedro is on a positive punishment contingency, his sister had a behavior, she punched Pedro. As a result of that punching, she no longer was being punched, so the punching was taken away. And we can imagine that the result of this is going to be her punching Pedro more in the future. So while he's under a positive punishment contingency, she's actually under a takeaway, punching increases on her side, negative reinforcement contingency. And this is part of that feedback loop that I was mentioning in terms of, oftentimes in terms of domestic violence, that the person that is inflicting the positive punishment is oftentimes negatively reinforced for doing that punishment. And you ever wonder why people get extremely abusive over time? It's because of this negative reinforcement for punishment. So again, that is very tempting to infer here, because she punched him, and then you might say to yourself, you know what, I'm sure she's gonna be reinforced by the fact that he never punched her again. You're absolutely right, but that's not mentioned in terms of what happens to her frequency of punching. It's only Pedro's punching that we know has changed. So limited to that first step, what's the behavior that changed? We have to limit it to that. All right, we got one last one here. And this one, now that I'm looking at it, I don't like it anymore. It's a little ambiguous. So I'll break this one down to you in terms of what I was thinking. But again, this is, we won't have anything like this on the exam. So it goes, Andre changed the Wi-Fi password when his son talked back to him. Andre's son no longer talks back to him. So a couple of things are very clear here. Number one, the changed behavior is the talking back. So Andre's son talked back. After the consequence, he no longer talks back. So talking back is being changed. Talking back has decreased. So that means that this is punishment. And I meant this to be that the access to the Wi-Fi was taken away, but it's not as clear as some of the other ones. So if you see this as access to the Wi-Fi being taken away, this is an example of negative punishment. And that's what was intended here, but I could see how changing the password could be seen in another way I won't mention. But anyways, this would be an example of negative punishment. All right, so that was what I wanted to make sure that we went through on this review session. The rest of today is just kind of open to any questions that anybody else might have, anything that you might want to see again, in hopes of getting everybody prepared to absolutely destroy exam number 2. So if you have any questions, let me know, put your hand up, and we'll go through some stuff.
Post another example exam?
No, not for this one. The example exam was just kind of get you familiar with sort of the style of it. So I'm even torn on the first example exam because it's literally the leftover questions, which I feel sometimes gives students the wrong idea in terms of what to focus on. So it's almost like, oh, I've ignored, this section. I've heavily ignored this section of the textbook. So those are the only questions that are left over. So I kind of feel sometimes on the example exam, students are like, oh, you seem to be asking a lot of questions on this concept, so maybe I'll really spend some time studying on that. And it's the complete opposite. That's why I had that announcement for the first one. But now that you kind of know the kind of exam that it is and you're familiar with the format, the need for that kind of like, oh, here's just an intro is not as great. But I will tell you that these questions came from the same pool that some of your questions are going to be, that your questions came from on the exam. So there definitely will be what's the contingency type questions on this exam. So yeah, if you got these ones all correct, then you're probably really good to go for the exam. These ones again are the ones that I rejected, either because I thought they were worded incorrectly or they were worded ambiguously. So if you can do these ones, you're in really good state for that. But lest you think it's all going to be identifying contingencies, it is going to be every chapter since the last time that we had the exam. So just make sure that you kind of review that. They will be equally weighted, but this was just a section of the exam that I kind of identified in previous semesters as causing the most difficulty for students. Mm-hmm.
Do we have to know how to use operating condition notation, like how to use it?
You say that one more time, please.
Exam the operating condition notation, like in classical conditioning, kind of write it out.
Yeah, so you might end up with operating conditioning notation. The thing with operating conditioning notation is that it's basically exactly the same as classical conditioning notation. So for example, the colon means that this is followed by this. The arrow means that this caused this to occur, so this stimulus caused this outcome. And you definitely will need to know things about what is the abbreviations. So like the S superscript D, S superscript DP, so discriminative stimulus for reinforcement, discriminative stimulus for punishment. So much like in the previous exam, you might have been asked, well, what's a CS, what's a US? In this exam, you will need to know those as well. Like what's a R, what's an S, what's an SDP, SD triangle, SD. I think those are the only ones. Oh no, there's the, no, those are the only ones. Yep.
I guess I'm trying to figure out how you would ask questions about the higher order.
The higher order conditioning?
Yeah, is it like how to identify it or? Like I understand what it is, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm confused on how to ask the question about like an example.
Well, I mean, you might be asked to identify a situation as higher order conditioning.
Okay.
So for example, if I say something like, Pavlov, a dog was trained to salivate when a bell was rung by pairing the bell with meat. Later on, it salivated to a light by pairing the light with the bell. This is an example of, higher order conditioning. You might ask for the specific components of higher order conditioning. Yeah, just basically kind of identifying it, I think, and that kind of what's the primary condition stimulus, what's the secondary condition stimulus, things like that. I think would be where higher order conditioning would go in terms of this question.
Two questions. One, are the percentage rates for like part 1 and part 2 going to be how they were for the first exam?
Yep.
And 2, if I have like any questions later today, is your email available?
Is my
Email available?
yes, Canvas messages.
Okay.
I'm going to be clearing those out tomorrow. because I've had a really good response to the social media development stuff, so I have like 30 in my inbox. So if yours is not about that and it's one of the 30, I will be getting to all those. But yeah, definitely I'm going to be clearing it out, and you can check those if you have a question that comes up after today. Yep. Yep.
So, for the higher order conditioning, if
Yep.
you know, like, well, so basically, like, when we did, like, the lecture on it, it was associated with, like, kind of, like, good feelings.
Yep.
It can do that with, like, negative feelings also, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. So you can basically have your conditioned response be whatever it is that you want. So your conditioned response can be, positive feelings, negative feelings. It could be observed behavior like salivation, overt behavior. It could be that covert behavior like good feelings, bad feelings. So really your conditioned response could be anything, and you are just making a previously neutral stimulus elicit that conditioned response, cause that conditioned response. So the reason I'm sort of dancing around what the conditioned response could be, though, is because of that preparatory response theory that we covered. So sometimes your conditioned response looks exactly like your unconditioned response. So the Pavlov's dog is like a classic example of that, where you give the dog food and the dog salivates, and then you train him, and when you ring the bell, the dog also salivates. So food causes salivation, the unconditioned response is salivation. The bell causes salivation, the conditioned response is salivation. So those two are exactly the same. On the other hand, sometimes your conditioned response will be opposite, right? So in the example with the rat, if you play a tone and then shock a rat, the shock will cause the rat to jump, right? That's the unconditioned response. But eventually the tone will cause the rat to freeze, which is the complete opposite of jumping. But it's understandable when you realize that according to the preparatory response theory, the purpose of the conditioned response is to get you ready for the unconditioned stimulus. So if you know you're about to get shocked and you need to jump, the best thing to do is to wait and get into jumping position. If you know that the unconditioned stimulus is food, the best thing to do is to salivate, to get your food ready, to get your mouth ready. So the conditioned response is seen as a preparatory response for preparation for your unconditioned stimulus. So, but you can, depending upon what is being prepared for what, condition good feelings. You can condition bad feelings. So that's what happens in any celebrity endorsement if you hate the celebrity. So all of us have celebrities that we probably can't stand. Some of us for a very good reason. So one of the reasons that you put big name celebrities in your movies isn't because they're necessarily the greatest actors. Like Mark Wahlberg is a great example. I mean, I like the guy. He's a decent actor, but he's not like, nobody's going to take a look at him in Transformers and go, oh my goodness, what a nuanced performance, right? But you want him in your movie because he has been associated with so many, action movies, so many good movies, so many enjoyable movies, that when you see him, you're like, oh yeah, I like him, and I'll go see this movie. The movie gets conditioned to be a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus where you want to see that movie. On the other hand, Kevin Spacey went from being an actor that people had positive feelings towards to an actor that people have very negative feelings towards, right? Because of the whole Me Too movement and his allegedly being a sexual predator, right? So yeah, this is going on YouTube. I don't want a cease and desist letter coming in through the mail. So allegedly, right? And check out his. You can check out the his legal proceedings right now. His accuser pleaded the fifth to avoid self-incriminating himself. I think it was over alleged drug use. And because of that, his testimony got thrown out. And because of that, I think the case got thrown out. So Spacey is I think, free at this point. So, anyways, if you remember, there was a movie, and it actually had Mark Wahlberg in it, and Kevin Spacey in it. It was directed by Ridley Scott. Does anybody know the one I'm talking about? Something Money, I can't remember what it was. Anyways, once the news broke about Kevin Spacey's involvement in the Me Too movement, Ridley Scott reshot every single one of Kevin Spacey's scenes with another actor. And he did that not because Kevin Spacey was any less of an actor. It's not like all of a sudden all of his acting skills just went up in smoke. But now when people saw him, he became a conditioned stimulus for very negative emotions. So now when you see him in a movie, you would say to yourself, I'm actively going to avoid that movie because I have bad feelings towards that particular individual. And that's why they took him out, because they didn't want that higher order conditioning to impact people's positive feelings towards that movie. And it was Christopher Plummer replaced him, and they reshot all those scenes. And that was the one where Michelle Williams was in that movie, and when they called them back, Mark Wahlberg ended up making $800,000 for the reshoots, and she ended up making $10,000. And there was a huge backlash against that gender pay gap. And yeah, that was part of that. That was just a troubled movie. so many things went wrong with that movie. But again, what it all boils down to is that idea that all these negative things get conditioned to the movie, and all of a sudden that movie becomes a neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus that causes those negative feelings. Not because the movie ever did anything bad, but because the people in the movie did bad things. So they were the conditioned stimulus that was paired with the neutral stimulus through higher order conditioning led to those negative feelings. Mm-hmm.
For your peace of mind, it's all the money in the world.
All the money in the world, yes. All right. So that was the one where they reshot. Thank you. And I would have pulled out my phone, but yeah. Thank you for that. Anything else? Any other questions about stuff that's upcoming on exam 2? All right, well, if anything else comes up, I will be monitoring Canvas, and I'll be clearing out my inbox today and tomorrow. So definitely if anything comes up, let me know, but we'll see. We'll see if this was an effective review session. So again, remember the 3 steps when you're answering those questions, and hopefully we'll get some increased exam 3 scores. Other than that, we are good for the day.